This book is a wreck. The front cover's detached, the spine is showing, and sadly there are some big tears in the title page and half title page. So why did I buy this book? Been through the wars, but sometimes with rare books, it's the story that sits within the tattered covers that really makes it interesting. So what is this? This is Sculpturae Veteris Admiranda, which roughly translates to the admirable works of ancient sculpture. And it was produced in Nuremberg in 1680 by this lovely haired character, Joachim von Sandrart. And he was an interesting character at the time. But what makes it more interesting isn't just who he is, but also who did he make this for and who owned it? And then lastly, how did it end up here in Sydney? So who is Joachim von Sandrart? In my research, I found that he's been referred to as the German Vasari, which my understanding of who Giorgio Vasari is one of the very early art historians who kind of created the idea of the biographer of artists. And what made von Sandrart so interesting in my perspective is that he was very much embedded in this world throughout his life. He grew up in kind of Germany, from Frankfurt, and traveled around to London, to the Netherlands, and then down into Italy. And during his time, he was known as a painter and a sculptor. But the other thing is, when he spent some time in Rome, he actually lived and worked with some really interesting characters there, known as the Rome crew. I like to think of them as criminals, but actually they just sounded like painters, which is what they were. And they were famous for drawing sculptures of ruins. And kind of he was kind of working amongst those. So that's Nicolas Poussin and Claude Lorrain. And I think knowing that history, knowing who he is, knowing who he was working with at the time, really sets that scene and the context for when he created this. So this is a book of so many gorgeous plates of ancient Roman sculptures. And what would have been quite interesting is that this book would have been used by Northern Europe elites, who may not be able to get to Italy to look at sculptures. And it would have given them a picture and an understanding of what does beauty look like from a sculptural perspective. The other thing that I find interesting about this, having tried to interpret and translate some of the Latin descriptions, is that it goes through and talks about not just them as beautiful statues, but kind of analyzes them. And so he breaks down a lot of the anatomy, the proportions, the stances of statues. And I think that takes that one step further into art history, as opposed to just developing a nice book of beautiful images. Who he made this for. So this was, as I said, was produced in 1680. And it was dedicated to the Elector of Palatine at the time. And the Elector of Palatine is one of the German princes who had a say in and a vote in who was going to be the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in that period. And he produced this in 1680, which was the exact date when the new elector, which was Charles II, ascended to the throne, probably, I'm not sure of the term, but became the prince of the Elector of Palatine. And I can't say that he did it for that purpose, but my understanding is that he had a close connection to that family. He painted their portraits, and it was most likely that he dedicated this book to him as the elector, and that kind of was able to fund the work and the production of this. The other thing that's really interesting, apart from who he is and who he made it for, was then, well, where did it go from there? And amazingly, it still holds all 70 pages, and despite this detachment, they are the original boards. It's still the original binding. And if we actually go to the front board, we still have the ownership of 3 of the early owners of this book. The first one is John Wilson, MA, a fellow and bursar at Trinity College in Cambridge. So already that's a very eminent role for someone in around the early 1700s to own this book, which kind of distinguishes it as owned by someone in that kind of higher scientific and university space. From there, it moved from John Wilson, who was the bursar at that time, at his death in, I think, around 1754, onto William Cooper. And again, we don't have too many details about William Cooper's ownership of it, except that it states his role at the time of ownership and that he had ownership in 1778. So William Cooper was the Archdeacon of York. He was also a fellow of the Royal Society. So again, that really lifts this up into kind of a very important document that was collected by, I suppose, key researchers in antiquities and art at that point in time. From there, I think that's where the journey kind of changes and moves in a different direction. It was owned by someone by the name of W.L. Lushington, Esquire, A.M., which was a lodge in Kent. So effectively a landed gentry in Kent somehow came across this book, whether that was through ownership that he purchased or whether it was passed on from the likes of Cooper somehow. But the big question for me is, when I saw this the first time, I was like, wow, that is an amazing book. It's an amazing book in its own existence, and the fact that it's still held together with all 70 plates. It's amazing who he was. It's amazing who owned it. And there I am in the Blue Mountains of Sydney saying, how did it end up here? Really still in its original bindings. The fact that it still has its 70 plates. I'd like to keep it all in one piece. I know that books like this in the past get broken up into their individual plates and kind of sold off as those individual pieces. I'd like to keep it as one. So I'm going to do a bit of digging. Keen to hear your thoughts in the comments about what should I do. Should I just get it repaired? Should I get rebound? Is that a waste of money? Should I actually break it up for the plates? And going forward, I'm going to continue digging into really interesting books that I find along my journey. As I said, I'm kind of moving from being a collector into a book dealer. Not that I like that term. For me, it's all about connecting people with books they love. And the stories that sit behind the books is kind of the reason I do it, which is why I love exploring things like this. So please follow, like, and subscribe, and hopefully I can get more videos out to you soon.